Good day, friends. Will you pray with me? Fill us with curiosity, O God, and open our minds, our hearts, and our souls so that we may find meaning in these sacred words. Amen. This last Monday, my daughter, Nettie, turned 7 years old. This smart, strong, funny, brave, joyful, compassionate, and beautiful child is the most extraordinary person that I have ever had the joy to meet. Her life has given me gifts abundant day after day, and I feel the deepest gratitude to be her papi. Feliz cumpleaños, mi almita. The day that this little person emerged into the world was cold and blustery, with the wind being pulled over the ice of Lake Michigan. Nora's labor was long and complicated, and by the time the emergency surgery was complete, it was deep into the darkest parts of the night. And yet there was this little cry, reaching out into the cold brightness of the world, seeking help, seeking love, seeking to know that she was not alone. And because of the worries post-C-section, I got to be the first person to lay my tired and oh so eager eyes on this new life. And there she was, naked and alone on a warming table waiting for me. And I walked over and I was absolutely overwhelmed by the sight of her. She had my face, and yet Nora's eyes and nose and a whole bunch of thick black hair. And I stood there, paralyzed by the twin reactions of love and fear. I stood there and was instantly drenched with the reality that I had absolutely no idea what to do. I waited for someone to tell me what I was allowed to do, what I could do, but all hands were busy putting Nora back together again. I was afraid that I would hurt her or that I would do something wrong. Quickly, though, I decided to set aside the fear and to act with love. I quickly seized upon my authority as her papi, and I got down close to her. And I smelled her sweet newness. I put one hand on her chest and the other on her hand, and I began to talk to her. In that moment, I used my power to act in gentleness, in love, and in warmth. While this birth of a new life is a particular example, I imagine that this moment of decision points to something universal. We have each, every one of us, been presented by moments in which we must decide what our involvement will be, what our authority might be, what is within our power to do. And these questions of authority and power are foundational to the human experiment, and we have attempted to create answers in many ways. Sometimes we have done so through loving, healing, compassionate means, but often humans have found it easier to do so through war, subjugation, enslavement, theft, violence, marginalization, and state-sanctioned crucifixions. This text that we heard earlier that Jenny read so well seems to be wrestling with this. God will bring a prophet who will carry God's truth, and we must listen to them. unless they are acting in the name of other gods or speaking falsely about this God, and then they will die. The division seems clear. Some prophets are sent by God and others are pretenders to this authority. And it is clear, at least until we, those asked to follow, wonder how we will know the difference. A similar question arises in the Mark text. Jesus has recently found some friends to follow his teaching, and they enter a synagogue, and Jesus begins to teach. And the people there were astounded by his teaching because he did so with authority. And then he encountered a sick person who was healed, and all who saw it were again amazed at this authority. And this seems straightforward until we, the followers of Jesus in this story, wonder what authority he presented. What did he do that was so authoritative to be astounding? In some ways, it's easy for us to assume the answer now because we think we know the rest of the story. We can settle into a presumed knowledge of who was a real prophet and who was not because we have this whole biblical text that tells us an answer. The prophets are named as prophets in the telling of their stories, but was it always clear in the time to those who were there? We know that false prophets still to this day have abundant followings. So how did the ancient Israelites distinguish one prophet from another? Using this keyword from the Mark text, how did they know who was speaking with authority? Of course, we will never quite know the answer to this question. But we might be able to come up with a meaningful guess, though, if we begin to look more closely at the word authority. The Greek word for authority in Mark is exousia. This word is mostly translated into English as authority, but it can also mean the power to act. And this has both a spiritual and an earthly meaning. So if we replace this new translation into the text, it now says, "For he taught them as one having the power to act." And what is this? A new teaching with the power to act? To my ear, at least, this alternative translation changes the power dynamic. Authority seems to imply the power over another, or one having more ability than another. Whereas the power to act seems to be more accessible. Jesus had the power to act. And so do I. And so do you. We all have the power to act. This power to act is foundational to our humanness. So if we continue to play with this alternative translation, what then made Jesus' actions so astounding? If all of us have the power to act, what then gives Jesus' actions this extra significance? Now, the text doesn't tell us what he taught that was so powerful. But we can assume, based on what we later learn about Jesus' teachings, that it was likely a recommitment to love. Later in Mark, we hear Jesus declare that the greatest commandment is to love God and to love the other as you love yourself. And this teaching was so very different than what was typically taught in this first century Jewish region of the Roman Empire. In that milieu of imperial oppression, purity laws, and strict rule adherence, a person teaching that the love of God, self, and other is primary to all else was astounding. And then for Jesus to put those teachings into action by healing a sick person was love in action. Dealing directly with a sick person in the synagogue defiled one's appearance of purity. Most sick people were ignored and avoided. Jesus not only taught with the power to act, but then he demonstrated it. Most people would have been afraid of the sick man. the one described as having demons. Instead, Jesus took his teachings and applied them in action. He walked the walk, so to speak. This was an action with great cultural consequences and could likely have been frightening. To act against the expectations of one's society is frightening. To act in a way that ignores the socially constructed rules and instead focuses on the love and healing of a marginalized person would have been frightening. We don't know if Jesus was frightened, but we do know what the story says his actions were. How often have we ignored the hurting of those around us, or those directly in front of us, because of societal fears and expectations? How often has our fear of what society would say about us stopped us from living this commandment to love God and to love the other and to love ourselves? How often do we suppress our own authority, our own power to act because of the potential social consequences? Fear is a contagious thing. My daughter's friend recently described in detail the monster that lived under her bed and the fear that gripped her. So at bedtime, Nettie was afraid, not because she thought there was something under her bed, but because of the monster under someone else's bed. And so we talked about how sometimes people try to make others afraid with them so that they feel less alone in their fear. We pull others into our fears because then we feel validated in them. And since fear is so easily contagious, we begin over time to create societal rules based on these fears. Instead, what if we used our power to act, our own authority to act in love and not in the contagious fears of our culture? What if we approached the metaphorical sick person in the synagogue with loving compassion instead of avoiding them out of fear of what society will say? I know this is a difficult task, which is why Jesus' teachings and actions were so amazing and astounding. He used his authority, his power to act in love, connection, and healing, instead of through fear, avoidance, and distrust. We all encounter these moments when a decision is presented to us. And we often have to make a quick decision about how to respond. Do we respond in love or in fear? Fear may be contagious, but so is love. And when more and more of us choose love instead of fear, it helps us feel less alone. We have all had our own moments similar to my story of staring at a newborn child, when we are briefly caught between the fear of doing the wrong thing and the desire to act in love. And all of us at times have chosen love. You are not alone in this. None of us are alone in this. And the more that we do it, the more contagious it can become. And we have all avoided the sick person too. We have all chosen to give in to the societal fear. There will always be prophets and false prophets. But we can begin to know the difference based on who uses their power to act, their authority in love, instead of those who use it in fear. There will always be sick people in the synagogue, so to speak. And it is up to us to choose to use our authority and love and not in the reasons why our society fears these people and then tells us to avoid them. Fear may be contagious, but so is love. May we all use our authority, our amazing and astounding authority, to act in love to God, in love to the other, and in love to ourselves. Amen.